put a glass bottle.
Hello everyone and welcome to the feeling you get when you turn the pillow over at night, otherwise known as a Warframe video! Yay! And oh boy, we have some actual things happening in Warframe this last week or two. DE actually released, wait for it, new content! Well, I mean, kind of. I don't really count a new frame and some rehashed game modes as content, but we do have Schwarzen Hero! But to the point of this video, Gauss. Gauss? House. Gauss is the new speedy boy frame, and my god, people thought this was the new Vault, didn't they? And I can kinda see where they're coming from. I mean, they both do their best impression of the Flash, but honestly, in terms of playstyle, Gauss is, to me, more resembles Zephyr or Rhino with how the movement works and how the functionality of the abilities therein lie. Gauss came in with an array of new things with this most recent patch, ranging from two new amazing weapons, the Exceltra, a crit-based missile-firing rifle, as if you couldn't get anything better these days, and the Makari, an awesome dual-wielding pair of pistols that have projectiles that lock onto enemies and have a high status chance with a default amount of blast damage. Oh, and a cool skin for Harrow. That's kind of cool. And Schwarzen Hero! It also came with what I'd say is DE's way of making up for the lack of frame quests recently. The Lumeria, which is kind of like what you get if you went to a pretentious hipster art gallery, but instead of a stick of celery-coloured red being the main attraction, this gallery instead shows off all the items that came with the update. Although Gauss may never be a core meta frame with his kit the way it is, Gauss is at the very least a fun frame to play. I mean, who wouldn't find dashing around the map with infinite speed to then be able to turn into a Super Saiyan fun? I mean, Gauss will find his self-contained abilities, keeping himself alive through his 2 and 4, very alluring, allowing him to become immune to knockdowns, almost all forms of specific types of damage, while then being able to perform adequate amounts of crowd control and area effect damage to aid a team fight. Realistically, the way to look at Gauss is that he's a great frame regardless of what you do with him, because his abilities are very simplistic, very surface level, and to the point, where you can basically pick him up, learn his playstyle, but he then does also offer some levels of depth for those who enjoy getting the most out of frame, using his ability synergy with how the abilities interact with each other to then push out even more damage, even more potency, and to really show how tempo can affect the way a frame is played. As with a lot of frames that are tempo-based, you often see more potency the better you play them to the tempo. Whereas with Gauss, tempo is pivotal to the way you actually interact with your environment and the enemy. Oh, and for those asking, Gauss is obtained from Rotation C from the new disruption mission on Sedna called Kelpie. Yeah, not really that hard to get, really. It's just that each of the individual components has a 10% chance of dropping. So, assuming you have none of them, you got a 30% chance on Rotation C to get one of the items you want. It's gonna be a little bit of a grind, but for the sake of a new player experience, it is relatively easy to get. It's just, again, one of those kind of grinds. And to me, is quite a nice stepping stone up from a lot of the early game frames you would otherwise normally get a hold of earlier in the game. And now we can take a look at Gauss's abilities. And again, these are subject to change, seeing as he is so new, so keep that in mind. His passive is called Electrokinetic Battery. This passive is probably one of the most enigmatic of any of the frames, as it really speaks to the image Gauss portrays. This is a battery that charges by 1% for every 1.8 meters he moves, or by casting any of his abilities, which will most likely be your one, let's face it. Initially, however, you will only have access to 80% of this battery, but using your 4th ability will then unlock the final 20%, allowing it to then scale with your other abilities therein. He additionally gains bonus shield recharge rate and reduction recharge delay the more the battery is charged. Kinda nifty, no? This charge is also a key component to his later abilities, as mentioned, and you will need to synergize this to make sure you're getting the most out of it. The first ability is called Mach Rush. Gauss will fling himself towards at a rate of knots, turning into the fastest man alive, Barry Allen, instantly charging 10% of his battery. Now, the interesting thing with this ability is there's a couple of different ways you can execute it. If you tap the ability, like so, it'll then send you lurching forwards for 12 meters. Holding the key will send you running at full speed until the key is released, or if you crash into an object. But wait, there's more. If you're holding the W key, or forwards on the controller, and then you hold the button for more than a second, it will then toggle Mach Rush to then be consistently charging even if you let go of the 1 key, allowing you to basically run consistently without needing to wear out your middle finger. But wait, there's even more. This also allows you to run across bodies of water you would otherwise drown in, like a stone. I think DE might have a god complex, because I think they're turning Gauss into Jeebus. I mean, he can walk on water, and he's pretty he's basically Speed Jesus. That is what this frame is, Speed Jesus. When Gauss rushes past or through an enemy within 4 meters, that enemy suffers a standard knockdown. Imagine Roadrunner and the Coyote. Yep, we made a Roadrunner reference. What's next? A Sonic reference. Gotta go fast. Should Gauss lose his sense of direction or have an altercation with a solid object, he comes to an immediate stop and sends out a shockwave that will knock down enemies in a 10-meter radius and inflict 800 impact damage. And a little tidbit of synergy, having kinetic plating active, which is your 2, will then cause the rushing damage and the slam damage to add slash damage to the overall damage you deal by the explosion, which is kind of cool. Don't know how, probably shrapnel of some kind. I mean, when you're running that fast, you're probably kicking a bunch of little dirty bits. The knockdown radius and explosion radius are affected by ability range. The explosion damage is then affected by ability strength. This ability is one of the main reasons it is highly advisable to mod for a lot of efficiency, as it does sap your energy quite dramatically over the time that it's active and the time you're running. So the drain that is affecting you whilst you are running and the activation cost is then affected by ability efficiency. You definitely want at least streamlining your builds to make sure you're not draining your energy faster than me when I discover that Coke is half priced at my local convenience store. Gauss's 2 is kinetic plating, and this is his survivability ability. When activated, you gain a amount of damage reduction based on the the charge amount of your battery. So the higher the charge, the more of a damage reduction you get. You also then gain an immunity to eye impact, puncture, and slash, as well as blast, cold, and heat procs, which is very potent and which will be useful throughout any mission you do. So you'll want to try and make sure you have this active at any given time. What you have to realize, though, is that an X amount of % of the damage taken is then taken away from your battery. The damage reduction is also rather interesting, as it scales based on the amount of energy stored in your battery. Below 40% of your battery, you're reducing at a minimum 50% of damage income, and at full battery, you reduce 100%. That's right, 100%. But obviously, it's going to be hard to maintain that 100% battery, so you gotta be more active to maintain the higher damage reduction. This ability really emphasized the idea of maintaining flow and tempo to your abilities, and really rewards you for being more spam happy and getting into combat, as you convert 5% of damage taken into bonus energy additionally. So the more you're getting into combat, so TLDR, the more you fight, the more abilities you use, the tougher you become, and the more energy you regenerate. This is what the ability that you should ideally have active at any given time to make sure that you're complementing everything else you do. The duration of this buff is affected by ability duration, the damage reduction scaling with the battery capacity, and is then affected by ability strength. So ability strength will make the conversion of damage and battery charge more efficient. Maxing damage reduction cannot exceed 100%, however. Minimum damage reduction cannot go under 50%. So you have those two that minimum and the maximum within the ability. Synergy time! As with most of these abilities, there's some synergy between each other. Whilst having kinetic plating active, if you then activate your red line, you then gain a 100% base melee damage, and you have a 100% chance to stagger as well, which is really, really nice. Gauss's 3 is called Thermal Sunder. Well, it wouldn't be a caster frame if we didn't have at least one ability that focuses a bit more on damage, right? Thermal Sunder is an interesting ability that summons a radial ring of 10 meters that will shrink slowly over time. And it deals different damage depending on the way you use it, as it can be used in one of two different ways. Thermal Sunder is an interesting ability that summons a radial ring of 10 meters that will shrink slowly over time and deals different damage depending on the way you use it, as it can be used in one of two different ways. Tapping the ability, like thus, will deal a amount of cold damage to the enemies that are caught within the ring. Tapping the ability again to the same enemies within that ring will then freeze them, similar to a Frost's Icy Avalanche or an Frost's Freeze in general. Holding the key will then cause that same ring to instead deal fire damage. So this ring of fire is just a heat proc, and then using the same ability again within that ring, much like the ice top doubling up on itself, will then deal additional fire damage, doubling up on the fire damage you deal. So essentially, tapping it once will deal cold, tapping it twice will freeze those enemies affected by the cold, holding once will deal fire damage, holding twice will up the fire damage. So that's the baseline. But then there's more. There is some crossover between these two modes when combining the forms of damage. Casting both heat and cold will merge damages to cause a radial explosion of blast damage. Depending on the order you cast, it'll then change the effect of what happens next. Casting cold first by tapping will then cause the enemies to be knocked back if you then use heat afterwards, like so. However, on the adverse of that, if we then start with heat and then tap for cold, the enemies are then tugged towards the center of the ring. The area of effect of the ring is affected by ability range, the duration of the freeze, as well as the duration of the fire, and the shrinkage duration of the ring itself is then affected by the duration. Potency of damage is affected by power strength. Now there's even more synergy. This ability also gains additional benefits from, you guessed it, red line. We've not even talked about this ability, and yet it's already hogging the bloody spotlight. Whilst red line is above the red line in the battery gauge, you gain additional benefits to this as well. With the cold proc, rather than taking 2 taps of the cold, it will now instantly freeze on the first cast, just so long as you're above that red mark. And then vice versa, with the fire proc, you gain the magnified fire damage on the initial cast as well, which is a very good way of getting that bit of burst damage out. Now, on the blast proc, when you combine these two abilities, so long as you're above the red mark, you will then strip up to 50% of the armor on the enemy. However, this armor strip cannot go above that 50% mark. It's just a nice little additional thing when you combine these two abilities together, that you're then stripping armor so long as you're above the red line mark. Now, finally, onto the ability that's been trying to edge its way into all the other abilities. Red line. Honestly, there isn't actually much left to really talk about on this one because it's pretty much already been explained through the other abilities already. But hey ho, a guide's a guide, I suppose. When activated, Gauss activates a super power Super Saiyan mode for 30 seconds, increasing reload speed, holster speed, and melee attacks based on his current battery level, emphasizing the idea of keeping your battery fully charged. The buffs are as follows at max battery power. The fire rate will go up to 75%. The attack speed will go up to 40%. The reload speed will additionally then go up to 50%. And the holster speed will go up to a maximum of 100%, which is really cool and sort of acts as a catalyst for upgrading all your previous abilities with everything we've mentioned that they do so far in terms of the synergy. Once activated, you'll notice your battery gauge gets a little percent mark next to it. This increases over time to 100%. On the initial filledness of your battery, once reaching 100%, the battery drain of the abilities will be completely negated. So yeah, this is one of those times where the ultimate isn't necessarily very complicated, but is instead a must if you want to get the most out of the previous abilities as mentioned prior. While the battery power level is above the red line limit, release, damaging projectiles will be released, arcing towards enemies, dealing electrical damage over a period of time. And finally, when the ability is activated, Gauss will send out a radial ring dealing 400 fire damage to enemies within 15 meters and knock them away flying, similar to how your one knocks things away when you land into something. The rate in which your buffs stack is affected by ability strength, as well as also the potency of the explosion and the damage your little balls deal as they fly out. And the radius of the explosion is also then affected by ability range. The first build we're going to look at, and really there aren't too many builds you can come up with right off the bat with Gauss because he's so generalized across all of his abilities. You'll find that most builds will prioritize towards a well-balanced element towards him, with maybe a bit of an emphasis towards duration. As always, the aura mod is subjective. Do what works for you. I like corrosive projection because it likes to strip armor, and that's going to be good for me. If you may be lacking some efficiency mods, it could also be worthwhile going with energy siphon to get that energy efficiency over time, to get energy regeneration, over time. Now, in this build, I would like to emphasize that Rush is nice because the speed of your 1 is affected by your base sprint speed. So having some additional movement speed will make that go faster, as well as being very fast on his own. You will then see a rather massive amount of speed from him. So this is personal preference. I could also suggest swapping this with power strength in place of something else just to make some of your abilities more stronger. But really, this mod spot is entirely down to what you think would work for you. However, everything else, we are looking at a lot of duration with prime continuity, with constitution and augur message to make sure our buffs last as long as possible. We then have range from augur reach and stretch to make sure our 3 and our explosive radius on our 1 is as big as possible. We then have a bit of power strength from intensify, and I could recommend maybe going a little bit more than 130% just to make the potency of your explosions as well as the damage a little bit stronger. But because I don't personally feel Gauss is really designed as a damage frame necessarily, I don't see it being too much of a need for him. And as always with these guides, we try to do a build that is much more new player friendly. However, because of how far Gauss is obtained into the game, this might not be as relevant for this video, simply because by the time you get to him, you probably have all the mods from the other build anyway. But if somehow you get him before that and you're looking for a much more simplistic, straightforward build, this is one that will work for you. You've got a bit of everything. You've got intensify for the power strength. You've got continuity for the duration, with augur message to complement that as well. You then have stretch for the range, streamline for the efficiency, and with this I've decided to put flow in there because you don't have the supreme efficiency of everything else, so you're more likely to be spamming your abilities here. Therefore, having a bit of extra energy is quite nice to fill in for the mods you wouldn't otherwise have. And with this, I have gone for a bit more survivability because you are not as likely to have your 2 active at all given times, and having steel fiber and both vitality on there will act as a good safety net whilst you get used to this frame. And that's the guide. I do hope this has been informative for you. Admittedly, I did have a bit of a struggle recording this for one reason or another, as the information coming out about it and as the testing went didn't really give me the information I needed. So there are very likely 1 or 2 little segments in this which aren't to my ideal levels of standards of how I make guides, but at the very least, hopefully you've learned something about Gauss. Or Gauss, or at the very least how to pronounce his name, because I sure haven't. If you want to come and join us, we do record these videos on stream. They'll be linked to my Twitch down below, and you can join in with them as well in the recording process, as well as also giving me constructive feedback on how much I mess up during the recording process. And you can also get your feedback in to dictate how they end up going. So thank you for watching, and I will see all you top hatters in the next video. Ta-ra!